Hello, my name is Kasha Anderson, and this is going to be my social reflection journal review. I will be looking at several readings. These are the readings right here that I'll be looking at. These 6 are PDFs that I pulled directly from our Social Differences site using several different topics that will be covered. And I'll do this in a series of YouTube clips so that it can be easily accessed. Before we get started, I've made a little compilation of social issues songs. So we'll just play that softly in the background. Excellent. So the first one that we're going to be looking at is an article written by Sarah Lucky. And this article addresses reverse racism and why it's not real. So the title of the article is Why Reverse Racism Isn't Real. It's an article that really talks about white privilege and what racism really is. So actually it really bears true to its name. Reverse Racism Isn't Real. The author really wants to put forward the message that she is like she says, she spends a lot of time on the internet, social media, various media sites, and she's noticed that often when people of color, this POC here, people of color, talk and express racial experiences that they had or experiences that they've had, with racism, that there are frequently, and she actually goes anytime, she uses the word anytime as opposed to sometimes, people chime in and talk about how, in fact, they have experienced reverse racism. So white people have chimed in and say that they have experienced reverse racism. And she says that this is not so. She goes on to sort of define that racism exists when there's prejudice and power have to be combined. So as a white person, you can't actually say you're being racially discriminated because you are in a position of power. And such, that the term racism can't be appropriate to you. Additionally, she sort of goes on to say that, I think she says here, that although many people have suffered individual experiences of circumstances where they had prejudice against them because they were white, these are not experiences of racism, but in fact just individual experiences of prejudice, because we are not in a situation, we as white people that is, are not in a situation where we're subjective or oppressed. So she sort of goes on to say several throughout that that using this term like reverse racism reinforces this viewpoint that right here, that it silences the people of color and really sort of appropriates their experiences, and it's not really an actual fact. So she goes on to say, like, listen, when you hear people of color sharing experiences, learn from the experiences, really appropriate your own prejudice, and look at the fact that you are not actually experiencing racism. So, so now when I look at this reading, like in terms of beyond what was actually said in the reading, I feel I really connected with the author, because I do feel that we as people of privilege sometimes have this inability to see that we are not actually being mistreated because we're so used to getting this privilege. And so she says that as herself in the article. She kind of goes on to express that, we often, because we live with these privileges, that when these privileges are taken away, we're taken aback, and then we start thinking, oh wow, I'm being treated racially, or having racism inflicted on me, when in fact we're just not getting this privilege that we have learned to appropriate as everyday common sense. So she's saying that people of race, they don't who actually experience racism don't have this feeling of privilege that constantly exists. They are, it's right here, like when white people complain about experiencing reverse racism, what they're really complaining about is losing out on or being denied their already existing privilege. So she says it way better than I did, but yeah, that's exactly it. We feel that it's unfair for being treated what we believe to be like being prejudiced against based on our ethnicity or our color, when this is not a systemic issue, it's an individual issue. So yeah, so as I say, I fully agree with the writer. I too have experienced several occasions where I've heard people use that term of reverse racism when they're in a social group and they feel like a minority, or they're not allowed to participate in something. I mean, even in our own class discussions, several students talked about either going on exchanges where they weren't able to participate in something because of their race, or not being able to participate in classes, for example, Aboriginal language classes because of their race. And they coined the term, that this is reverse racism. But I would again like concur as Sarah Lucky did, that they in fact are not being subjected to racism. They might be being prejudiced or biased against, but they are. It's an individual situation. It's not a systemic issue that's causing oppression. Uh, and in terms of other, I also would agree with Sarah that one thing we really need to do when we personally feel that we are being mistreated for whatever reason, we really have to go back and really reflect on our social locators. So I have this image here of a social identity wheel, and really, where do we sit on that wheel? What privileges or biases do we innately have in our based on just where we are on that wheel, on our age, our sexual orientation, our ethnicity, our gender, our race, our physical abilities, all those things. And then there's the secondary wheel that we talk about. All those things play into our ability to privilege. And ultimately, I go back to this sense that, we need to really reflect and try to be able to empathize with others. And, Sarah Lucky was sort of saying in the article best is that not only should we just reflect on our own privilege, but we should listen to other people. So she says she spends a lot of time cruising the internet and social media and just listening to conversations. And she does that to hear and to be able to, see how other people's lives are. So in order to systemically cause change and sort of bring this group that is currently a oppressed minority to have a greater voice. So she doesn't want that voice to be silenced by comments of reverse racism. She doesn't want that voice to the conversation to sort of derail, is a term she often uses, because other people then go off on this reverse racism train, as opposed to focusing on the individual experience that a person of color was talking about. And lastly, I found just doing a quick search on this sort of term, reverse racism, and seeing like is this something that's sort of being brought to light by more than one, or is this just sort of like a one shot media? When we're talking about being media literate and sort of checking our sources, and I did find that this is not just a one time source, even like the Huffington Post, which is, considered a prestigious paper, did an article during, of course, it was in Black Voices. So again, it is slightly in a, it shows us sort of the oppression there, because it's not just in your mainstream. It had to be under subcategory Black Voices, so which kind of shows us that it is a subcategory because most of the voices are white voices. But anyways, that's sort of a tangent there. But we see here 4 reverse racism myths that need to be stopped. So again, Zeba here also outlines, the whole concept of one of the things that it talked about is how, like, we talk about Black people being racist because they make racial comments, but here this clip actually talks about how, like, we can't be racist because it's a systemic disadvantage and we're disadvantaged, so we can't be the ones that are racist. So it talks about the whole privilege, the aspect of racial and prejudice is sort of being used, racism and prejudice being used interchangeably, and they're not really. That racism is most systemic. It is sort of a reinforced context based on the American history, sort of based on enslavement and forced segregation and all those things, and that those things have sort of moved into today's generations in situations where jobs are affected, where position of power and all that stuff, and talks about our white privilege and how um, um, the people of color are still a minority in the states, and that they're not given full power and rights, and that they are just innately subject to racism by our society. That it is not they are not the general voice of media, and as such they are sufferers of racism, and reverse racism is not actually a thing. Because yeah, so this is an interesting article. It really, like, again, and just even doing a quick search, it showed that several prominent newspapers have the same sort of voice, that white racism or reversed racism isn't a thing because we ultimately are in a position of power. Okay, so thank you for listening to the first video, and the next video will cover our next journal reflection.